Next, President Clinton. Today, he unveiled the official portraits of former President George Bush and First Lady Barbara Bush. Joining him, President Bush, both First Ladies, and Bob Breeden, who's the president of the White House Historical Association. This event is from the East Room at the White House.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Bob Breeden, Chairman of the Board of the White House Historical Association. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States and Mrs. Clinton, accompanied by former President George Bush and Mrs. Bush.
Seated. Welcome to the White House. We are delighted to have all of you here and to be able to have this event. I particularly would like to welcome former Vice President and Mrs. Quayle, all of the members of the Bush family, and we are so pleased that there are grandchildren here as well. We also would like to say a special word of welcome to members of President Bush's cabinet and to former heads of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and to all of the friends and colleagues of President and Mrs. Bush. They have been greeting so many members of the resident staff and having a time to reminisce and exchange information about how children are growing and what grandchildren are doing, and it is a very happy time for all of us. We are able to do this today in large measure because of the kindness and extraordinary generosity of private donors who, through the White House Historical Association, have been constant friends to this White House. And we are especially grateful for that. We have someone with us today, the chairman of the board of the White House Historical Association, who has been involved with the association for more than 18 years and has served as the chair for 5 years. And I think, as the Bushes and the Clintons would certainly have to attest, this association and its leadership are just absolutely essential to what you see around you, to the quality of the furnishings, the decor, and to the way we are able to open this house, unlike any other residence of any head of state anywhere else in the world, to the public, more than 1.5 million visitors every year. So please join me in welcoming Bob Breeden.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Clinton. President Clinton, President Mrs. Bush, Vice President Mrs. Quayle, and honored guests. On behalf of the White House Historical Association, let me say how much we appreciate this opportunity to take part in such an historic event, just as we also want to observe and to record it. The year 1995 is a very special and important anniversary for the association, for it was exactly 30 years ago that we began participating in obtaining official portraits of our First Ladies and Presidents. And that began with the presentation of the portrait of Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt. That was soon followed by the portrait of Mrs. Truman. And since that time, the association has been privileged to participate in the addition of portraits of all of the presidents and first ladies, beginning with President and Mrs. Kennedy, and now including President and Mrs. Bush. Those portraits and all of the official portraits before them make up an essential part of two biographical books on the presidents and first ladies that the association originally published many years ago. Those two books are a help to us in carrying out our mission to educate and to inform the public about the history of the White House and about the first families. The 14th edition of the President's book and the 8th edition of the First Lady's book are in preparation even at this moment. They will be off press in a week or so, and they will contain the portraits of President and Mrs. Bush that we see today. I would like to offer copies to everyone here of those two new books when they become available. Please accept them with our compliments. They will be mailed to you. It will be a very nice memento, I think, of this occasion. Let me add that all of the presidents and first ladies have been most supportive of the programs of the White House Historical Association since its founding in 1961. And they all have been most interested in the history of the White House. That can especially be said of President and Mrs. Bush and President and Mrs. Clinton. It's always a pleasure for any of us in the association to hear from someone who shares our interest in this great old house. Now, that's especially true if that someone is the President of the United States. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce, and it is a great honor to introduce President Bill Clinton.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Breeden, for your kind remarks and for your essential work in behalf of the White House and the history of this country. We're delighted to be here with President and Mrs. Bush today, and Vice President Mrs. Quayle, all the members and former members of Congress, the members of the Bush administration, and the friends of George and Barbara Bush, and especially the family members. We welcome you all here to the White House. It's impossible to live in this wonderful old place without becoming incredibly attached to it, to the history of our country and to what each and every one of these rooms represent. In a way, I think every family who has ever lived here has become more and more a part of our country's history just for the privilege of sleeping under this roof at night. And so perhaps the most important thing I can say to President and Mrs. Bush today is welcome home. We're glad to have you back. I want to say, too, that we thought that we ought to have this ceremony in the East Room. This has always been the people's room. In the 19th century, it used to get so crowded at receptions that one of the windows over here was turned into a door so people could get out if they couldn't bear the crowds anymore. There are so many here today, perhaps we should have done it again, but we thought the air conditioning made it advisable for us to all stay put. Many of you know that it was in this room that Abigail Adams used to dry the family laundry when the room was nothing more than a brick shell. You may not know that the great explorer Meriwether Lewis set up camp here surrounded by canvas, tarps, books, and hunting rifles in the day when he was Thomas Jefferson's secretary. John Quincy Adams frequently would come here to watch the sunrise after he finished his early morning swim in the Potomac. And that also is something we're considering taking up if the heat wave doesn't break. The portraits that we add here today celebrate another chapter to our rich history, and particularly the rich history of the East Room, where they will remain for a few days before they are properly hung. I managed to get a glimpse of these portraits, and I must admit that I think the artist did a wonderful job, and we're all in his debt. But I also want to say, President Bush, if I looked half as good as you do when I leave office, I'll be a happy man. I want to again compliment Herbert Abrams, the artist. He also painted the portrait of President Carter. So once again, President Bush has set another outstanding example of bipartisanship. These portraits, as has already been said, will be seen by millions of Americans who visit here, reminding them of what these two great Americans stood for and for what they have done to strengthen our country. The portraits in the White House are more than likenesses. They tell the story of the promise of one American life, and in so doing, the promise of all American life. They offer a lesson, an example, a challenge for every American to live up to the responsibilities of citizenship. As Americans look for ways to come together to deal with the challenges we face today, they can do well in looking at the lives of President and Mrs. Bush. They have been guided by the basic American values and virtues of honesty, compassion, civility, responsibility, and optimism. They have passed these values on to their family and on to our American family as well. And for that, we should all be profoundly grateful. Mrs. Bush's portrait will hang adjacent to the Vermeil room on the ground floor corridor, taking her place in history in the line of America's First Ladies. One role of the First Lady is to open the doors to the White House. Mrs. Bush will be in the hearts of Americans forever for the gracious way in which she opened so many doors, not just to this House, but to a world of endless possibility through reading. Her campaign for literacy exemplified our country's great spirit of volunteerism and our primary concern for the potential of every individual American. Her life of helping others has brought recognition to all those Americans, especially to American women, who have seen unmet needs in their communities and reached out to meet them. We cannot thank her enough. President Bush's portrait will hang out here in the grand foyer, across from the portrait of President Franklin Roosevelt, the commander-in-chief he served in World War II. It will stand as a reminder of George Bush's basic integrity and decency and of his entire adult lifetime devoted to public service. Most of all, it will stand as a testimony to a leader who helped Americans move forward toward common ground on many fronts. We see this clearly in the causes George Bush led us in as president, causes that aimed at improving the lives not just of Republicans, but of all Americans. He made education a national priority when he hosted the Education Summit in 1989, something I will never forget and always be especially personally grateful for, because he understood that a solid education is essential to every American's ability to meet the challenges of the 21st century. He led us to a new dedication to service and extolled the real heroes in America, the ordinary Americans who every day go about solving the problems of this country in courageous, brave, and quiet manners. The Points of Light initiative held up the best in America, reminded us of what we can do when we truly work together, and I can say that it was the one thing he did that he personally asked me to continue when I took this office, and I was honored to do it. because it was so important, and it remains important to the United States today. He signed the Americans with Disabilities Act, something that has now acquired broad support among people of all parties and all walks of life, and which has made a real difference to the quality of life of Americans who are now making larger contributions to the rest of us. And he supported and signed the Clean Air Act, which is terribly important today in preserving the quality of American life. He also led our nation and the world in the Gulf War Alliance, in an example of contributions and cooperations in the aftermath of the Cold War that I believe will long be followed. Finally, since he has left this office, he has continued to be an active and aggressive citizen for what he believed in. He worked here to help us to pass NAFTA, something for which I am profoundly grateful. And just the other day, he earned the gratitude of all Americans who believe in law and order and believe in civil citizenship when he defended the honor and reputation of law-abiding law enforcement officers and government employees. For all these things, all Americans should be grateful to George Bush. For President and Mrs. Bush, love of country and service to it have always meant the same thing. We honor them both today for their leadership, their character, and their concern for their fellow citizens. On November the 2nd, 1800, the day after his very first night in the White House, John Adams wrote to his wife, "I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house and on all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." In the case of George Bush, John Adams' prayers were surely met. It is my great honor and pleasure now to unveil the official portraits of President and Mrs. Bush.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Thank you all. Thank you. And thank you, President Clinton, for those overly generous words, those kind assessment of what I and so many here in this room tried to do. Frankly, I needed those kind words. I told some friends last night that I've been going through a bit of an identity crisis, highlighted when Barbara was having her hair done in January. Eddie, her accomplished hairdresser, said, "I can hardly believe it. I can hardly believe it." And Barbara said, "What is it, Eddie?" He said, "I can hardly believe I'm doing the hair of the mother of the governor of Texas." And Barbara said, "What about the wife of the president, former president of the United States?" Eddie goes, "Well, there's that too." So I can't tell you, Mr. President, how much I appreciate your wonderfully kind words. And to Mrs. Clinton, thank you for this superb hospitality. I know I speak confidently for everybody in this room when I thank you for the generosity of your time and of the way this matter here has been set up. To Ann Stock in the social office, to the White House Historical Association, and to everyone else, the Bush family, and again, I confidently speak for all, are very grateful to you for letting us come and for arranging this warm ceremony. I look around and I should not speak for the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, my dear friend Prince Bandar, but he is here, and I'm honored that he took the time to join us here today. It's hot out, and I've got to be careful about this nostalgic beat, but I see the photo dogs. I miss them. And I got to be careful, but as I look around and see Helen and Terry and Mick and Trudy and Ann, I even miss you, and I never thought I'd say that again. I honestly do. And so my role here is simply to say thank you, and to say how much, of course, we enjoyed living here and what a joy it is to see the White House staff. I'm asked, what do you miss about Washington? And I say not a lot, frankly, but I miss the White House staff and the people that the Clintons know do so much to make this not just the people's house, but the home for the people that are privileged to live here. And so I thank them, and I thank all of you for turning out today for what, for Barbara and me, is a most nostalgic, wonderful occasion. And Herb, I feel very differently than Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon looked at his first portrait and he said, that's the ugliest thing I ever saw. So I'm inclined to think it's pretty darn good. And to you, thank you, and I know Barbara feels the same way. You're wonderful, and we appreciate your work so much, sir. Thank you.
We would like to invite all of you to join the four of us for a receiving line in the blue room, and then through the red room into the reception. And again, thank you all very much for being here.
You can see this program again early tomorrow morning at 5:25 Eastern Time on our companion network, C-SPAN 2. Next, President Clinton. Today, he unveiled the official portraits of former President George Bush and First Lady Barbara Bush. Joining him, President Bush, both First Ladies, and Bob Breeden, who's the president of the White House Historical Association. This event is from the East Room at the White House.
Seated. Welcome to the White House. We are delighted to have all of you here and to be able to have this event. I particularly would like to welcome former Vice President and Mrs. Quayle, all of the members of the Bush family, and we are so pleased that there are grandchildren here as well. We also would like to say a special word of welcome to members of President Bush's cabinet and to former heads of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and to all of the friends and
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Bob Breeden, Chairman of the Board of the White House Historical Association. Ladies and gentlemen, the President.
need to put this back together, please. Step back. Well, just step back a little. That would help. Jim, don't do this. Just a step, Mike. Excuse me, Trudy, I do have to put this back.
We're not going to go past here, and it just hits us. He's very tall. Let me get you steps back.
Of the United States and Mrs. Clinton, accompanied by former President George Bush and Mrs. Bush.